Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of Said Institute, we'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you. Jazakallah khair for attending today. Nice seeing some familiar faces, alhamdulillah, and some new faces, of course. Today, we have an exciting program for all of you. A program where we explore the life of Fatima Cates. As some of you guys may know briefly, she's been a prolific figure in Britain, establishing the first masjid in Britain and creating an environment and a platform where Islam can flourish and grow that we today are benefiting from. So Alhamdulillah, we have none other than Ustad Yahya Birt, who has joined us today with his wife Dr. Fawzia. They've come from Leeds. So we are very fortunate to be in his company. Just by way of introduction, Ustad Yahya has studied at the University of Oxford. We studied various sciences, but specifically focused on completed his master's in philosophy on social and cultural anthropology. So we're in very, very capable hands and very knowledgeable hands. We've done extensive research on Islam in Britain, and we'll be inspired, no doubt, by his message, by the life and the struggles of Fatima Cates. No doubt we'll take some great inspiration and learning from that, inshallah. Before I hand over to Ustad Yahya, just a few logistics I want to share with you guys. First and foremost, I spoke about the traffic officials having a field day outside. So if you have parked on the yellow lines, please just move your vehicles until after 6, and then you're in the safe zone. Then you shouldn't be getting any tickets. If you hear any thumping on the roofs, the roof isn't going to come down. It's just the kids are having a fantastic time upstairs. They are in safe hands, so that we can give you some space to learn. And there are refreshments in the back, so please do help yourselves. For those who are new coming into Sakina House, on the entrance on the right there is toilet facilities as well if you need to go to the toilets. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ustad and enjoy the program, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And good evening. It's a great honor to be here at the Said Institute, and my thanks to Sheikh Siddiq and the whole team, mashallah. And can I speak up to about 6:30? Is that okay? Yeah, okay. And then we will have a Q&A after. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a bit of an overview generally about Islam and Muslims in Britain, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, to give you a kind of a background, and then I will focus on the life of Fatima. But I think everybody normally appreciates having the background because it gives them a context for Fatima's life. So the big context is, and this is the subject of a book that I'm slowly working on now, which is called Britannia's Crescent, 800 Years of Islam in Britain. And so I'm working towards the first narrative history of the story of conversion by British peoples to Islam. So it's an 800-year history. It goes back to the time of the Crusades. It goes back to the time when this was, from top to bottom, a Christian country, a Christian nation, a Catholic country. And it goes back to the Crusades, really. And that goes up to 1492. And then the second stage is when England, because England, Britain, the UK, the United Kingdom didn't exist back then. It was England and Scotland and Wales and Ireland were separate. And in 1492, really from that period onwards, that's when the Europe began to open up to the rest of the world through discovery and empire. It's a long history, but basically that was the impetus. That was what opened up the possibility for English people and Welsh and Scots to discover Islam and Muslims, usually through travel, through leaving Britain, through trade or diplomacy or scholarship and empire, okay, and all the different motives. And then the third age is the age of what I call Islamic counterculture. So actually, this is this period that I'm talking about today in more detail. But this is the period from about 1887 up until 1979 when there was a counterculture in Britain in which people were converting to Islam in Britain. They didn't have to travel anymore. They were finding and discovering Islam in Britain from the late 19th century. And they created a number of different movements that, if you like, were going against the grain of prevailing societal outlooks and norms. And we're going to hear about Fatima today, who's one of these great pioneers of this age of counterculture, really one of the first great figures in it. And the final stage is from 1979 up until the present, which is what I call the age of Islamic establishment. Okay, so this is now there are, if you take this 800-year view, the final chapter of the story is the one that we're living in, is actually quite a rosy picture. We've never had more conversion than in this period. The age in which, we have had a growing Muslim community migrating and settling to Britain after the Second World War. And what that now means is that today in Britain, in every even large town, let alone small city, let alone big cities, we have mosques. We have Muslims living there, we have community, and therefore we have a lot of opportunity for people to have contact with Islam and Muslims. So the conversion rate now is much higher than it's ever been historically. An educated guess, we do not have precise figures, but an educated guess would put the number of converts at around over 160,000. So let's say between 160,000 up to about maybe 200,000. But again, this is something that needs proper research. But, so we're living in a golden age as far as conversion is concerned. So let's go back to the time that we're talking about the time of Fatima Cates. So this is 125 years ago, around about 1900. And, today we live in a world of nation states, 237 nation states and territories in the United Nations. But back then, 125 years ago, we lived in an imperial world, basically. And the context that mattered for Muslims in Britain at that time, the handful of Muslims who were in Britain at that time, was two really great empires. One was the British Empire, which is on the left. You can see the map of the world. It sort of straddles the world, and it covered 25% of the land mass of the world, and it was tied together by a fleet, by military naval power, and by a great merchant fleet. So what linked it were the ocean routes, and something like there were 10 times more Muslims living under Queen Victoria than there were living under the Ottoman Sultan or Caliph. 10 times the number. Okay, so the British Empire was concerned with the question of Islam. It was very important to them because millions and millions of the subjects of the crown, the imperial crown, were Muslim. And basically, to simplify it, the British had two views of Islam at this time, around about 1900. So the first view was that the one they wanted to project, that Britain was a flag bearer for prosperity, free trade, and religious freedom. This was the kind of the imperial story or propaganda that was spread at the time. The other side of it was that people who were the Muslims who were involved and others who were involved in anti-colonial resistance at the time, they were described as the bad Muslims, if you like. They were seen as extremists, and so there was also a sort of counter-extremist language of the late 19th century in the British Empire, and so there was a kind of a good Muslim, bad Muslim, sort of good Muslim, bad Muslim in imperial British language. But it's important to understand that actually there was an attempt to say that Britain was the best home for Muslims and Islam. So there was an attempt at this sort of language. On the right-hand side of the picture, we have the Ottoman Empire as it was around about 1900, not at its fullest extent as it was in the 17th century under Suleiman al-Qanuni, Suleiman the Magnificent. At this time, it was reduced, but still very, very massive and of great extent. So it was still in South Eastern Europe, Turkey, the Central Middle East, and parts of North Africa. When the Ottomans began, really the Ottoman Empire at the beginning in the 13th century, it spread northwards into Europe. So most of its domains were within Europe. Later on, in the 16th century, actually, they conquered territories south of Turkey and took over the Middle East and North Africa later on. Then, in this period, by 1900, they've lost most of their European territory. So they went from being a European empire to becoming Middle Eastern empire. And that mattered a lot to how the Ottoman sultans actually kind of what they emphasized. And so in the later Ottoman Empire, they emphasized far more their Islamic credentials, the title of caliph, and the idea of the caliph, not only as the protector of Muslims and of Jews and Christians within the Ottoman territories, but at the end, under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, actually a protector of the religious freedoms of Muslim minorities living elsewhere. Now, this was partly a response to the kind of European imperial insistence that Christians be protected within the Ottoman domains. And that was pursued quite aggressively at times. So it was sort of a tit for tat, almost kind of treatment of religious minorities in each field. So why is this important? Because these imperial powers, they framed, we'll see later on, very much how relevant the British Empire was and how relevant the Ottoman Empire was to the first Muslims who lived in and settled and formed mosques in this country. So Muslims came to Britain for many, many reasons. One group were largely a group of women who were domestic servants and ayahs. Ayahs means nannies. And they were attached to English colonial families who had been in India and returned, and they brought their nannies and their servants with them. Often these could be relationships of great intimacy, but also of abuse. And these women could be thrown out onto the streets of London or elsewhere. And that is why an ayah's home, a nanny's home, was created in Hackney around about 1900 to house these women who'd been thrown out onto the street. Here we see a picture of two of them with their charges. Another group were the Lascars. Now in English, from about the 16th century onwards, this was meant non-European sailors employed in the British merchant fleet, the part of the fleet that went through the Suez Canal largely and through the Indian Ocean trade. It comes from Persian Lashkar or Lashkari, soldier. What happened was that when the British trade expanded with the cutting out of the Suez Canal in the 1860s and the invention of the steamship, huge expansion of maritime trade. And what would often happen is that, they might be manned with sailors from Britain when they set out from London or Liverpool or wherever they were coming from. But then soldiers fall ill, fall sick, or abscond, seeking fortune elsewhere in the empire, and they had to recruit new sailors. So these sailors were, Egyptians, they were Bengalis, they were Gujaratis, they were Pashtuns, there were Somalis. All these different Muslim peoples were employed by these ships, and they took them back to Britain. Often they did the dangerous work in the lower holds, stoking the coal into the engines, and it was back-breaking work, very, very difficult. Again, you know, the numbers were incredible. I mean, something like 50,000 men coming in and out of British ports by 1914, and that was more than 15% of the entire merchant navy fleet. So that meant a lot of Muslim sailors were coming in and out of British ports, not staying for too long. Sometimes they'd be dumped on the docks. They'd be looking for another employment, another ship to pick them up. So an itinerant population that's coming in and out of the country. Why is it that our first mosques are in ports? This tells you why. Because of the Lascars, because of the sailors, Muslim sailors. Another important group were soldiers. Okay, so in the First World War, the British Indian Army was 1.5 million, huge army, and by imperial policy, that couldn't be predominated by any one religious group. So the Muslim soldiers were capped at 1/3, 400K, 400,000. Now, you can watch war films and you'll never see a brown face in them, okay, or a black face, but actually the Western Front in France, scenes of terrible slaughter, there were hundreds of thousands of Asian men and African men employed by deployed by the Allies on the Western Front, including many Indian Muslims. Men were injured. They were sent back to Brighton, to the Brighton Pavilion, and it was renamed during the war as the Dome Hospital, where they were treated. And a dedicated burial ground for the men who were killed in action was built at Brookwood Cemetery, Peace Gardens, near Brookwood Cemetery in Surrey, which has recently been re-established and revived, with the help of Paul Weller, because Paul Weller's mum used to clean the Woking Mosque, and so he used to visit the mosque when he was a lad. So there's a connection to the mosque, and that's why it's been he helped out with the Peace Gardens that have been re-established. That's the men praying Eid al-Adha at the Woking Mosque in 1916 in uniform, in khaki. Another group that Dr. Fawzia, my wife, and I are working on now is another kind of history that's sort of unknown. So there were, during the colonial period in Europe and America, there were colonized and racialized people were put on public display in parks, in exhibitions, even inside sort of gardens and things like that. And this included Muslim peoples, Somalis in particular, and the Ashantis, who are also Muslim people from West Africa, were following the history of a particular group that came to Britain in 1904 and came to Bradford. I haven't got the picture on the slide today, but actually the first imam in Bradford was the Somali imam attached to this group. He came in 1904. They opened a madrasa. They taught Quran in the madrasa in Arabic, and 1,000 people, local people, came every day and watched them learning Quran and Arabic. He gave a khutbah on a Friday, and in one of the khutbahs was translated and inscribed by the local press, and he gave dawah. Basically, it's in one of the Bradford newspapers. So many first. The first funeral in Bradford, the first burial, the first Muslim grave is from this community, and the first birth, a little girl called Khadija Yorkshire. So a really interesting story, which we're in the process of working on at the moment. And then besides all these working people, nannies, soldiers, sailors, and people who came as part of ethnographic shows, we had notables. Most of these were upper class Indian Muslims who came to study law and medicine in London and Edinburgh. I've got a few people here. Can anybody name the gentleman on the left who came to study in law in London and also in Cambridge? Yes. How about the rather dapper looking gentleman in the middle? Can anybody name him? It is Jinnah. It is Jinnah. And the gentleman on the right, Dus Muhammad Ali, should be better known in our community. He founded the first anti-imperial black political journal in Britain. He claimed Egyptian Sudanese heritage, very important figure, and his journal was banned twice by the British and had to close, but a very important linking figure between different groups of people agitating against British imperial rule. So the journal he founded was based in London and was published during the First World War. So in this period between 1880 and 1920, 3 mosques were established in Britain. Liverpool on the left, Woking on the right, and in the middle, the London Temporary Mosque that was open for 5 years in the 1890s. It was associated with the Liverpool Mosque. The founder of the mosque actually was South African, came from Cape Town. His name is escaping me right now. I'm sorry. So the Woking Muslims. The mosque had been built in 1889 by an Orientalist by the name of William Lightner. And he had built it as a private establishment for the use of his students at the Oriental College. So technically it wasn't a mosque in the sense that it was not a public building and it was not publicly open to everybody. And he set restrictions on what it could do. The mosque fell into disuse after he died, but was reopened in 1913 as the Woking Muslim Mission. And in this picture here on the right, we see Khwaja Kamaluddin, who was a lawyer from Lahore. And he opened the mission in that year. And he's standing next to his most famous convert, Lord Farouk Headley, who converted in 1913, an Anglo-Irish peer of the realm. Now, he's important for another reason, that he set up the Muslim Society of Great Britain, which was the main national body for Muslims in Britain, which operated up until the 1960s. The history of it's yet to be written. Now, this mosque really focused on middle-class converts. They had a rather gentle way and an apolitical way, by and large, of presenting Islam. And they had nearly 400 converts in the first 40 years of their existence. They also published a journal which published up until 1967, which you can access online. So the main mosque I want to talk about today, which is the mosque that Fatima Cates established, and we're going to hear more about, was in Liverpool. And this mosque is more short-lived than the Woking one. So it only operated for 20 years. In that time, 243 people embraced Islam. Mostly they were local and working class. But it was not a sort of disconnected. What I mean by that, it was not it's sort of in a little bubble of its own. The opposite is true. It became an international sensation. It was well known. It became well known within a year of opening a new premises in Brown Terrace. So they were linked to different groups of Muslims. The Indian Muslims are very, very important for providing financial support and know-how. They sent imams to train them, to teach them. The Manchester Arab cotton traders, another very interesting community, an early community that was established in the early 19th century. So small groups of wealthy cotton traders, firstly from Morocco and secondly from Beirut. Later on they came from Beirut. They connected with the Ottoman world. And the other important group are the West Africans. So Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam, who we're going to hear more about in a second, he did a tour in West Africa, down the coast of West Africa in 1894, and opened a mosque on the authority of the Caliph, Abdul Hamid. So that they had very strong connections also with West Africa. And also with Cape Town, with the Muslim community in the Cape. The mosque became well known, and it had official recognition and patronage from 2 courts, the Ottomans and the Afghans, the Afghan court. The Afghans were particularly generous in terms of their patronage of the mosque. So Abdullah Quilliam is the best known founder of the mosque, but he's not the only one. Fatima was the other co-founder. He was a Liverpool lawyer and journalist. He came from a nonconformist background. That means from one of the small Protestant churches, not one of the established Church of England, but one of the smaller ones, the Wesleyan background. And he was part of a movement called the temperance movement. I don't know if you've heard of it, but basically it emerged in the 19th century. The idea was that alcohol was the cause of all social ills. And what they did, they required all their members to take a lifelong pledge to forswear drinking alcohol. Now, Quilliam, his family had been in this movement for 3 generations, so all of his grandparents on both sides had been members of this movement. So he grew up in this movement. So he took the pledge when he was 7. So he never touched a drop of alcohol in his life. He travels to Morocco, he falls ill, travels to Morocco, meets Muslims. They tell him to recite the Shahada. He says, look, I don't want to rush. I'm going to go home. I'm going to study for myself and find out more. After self-study and looking at all different scriptures, different religious scriptures of the world, he still decides on Islam and converts privately in 1886. But why he's important is because he decided actually that he wanted to call his community to Islam. And so in 1887, he sets up some rented premises above a temperance hall and just starts to preach Islam. And this is where, Fatima comes in. I hope that at the end of this presentation, you'll agree that, hers is a story of service and steadfastness. And I regard her as a very inspiring Muslimah. So Quilliam has started on his preaching tour, and he's already preached in Liverpool, and one man has listened to his call and embraced Islam, a man called Jem Hamilton, who takes the name Ali. Okay, and 2 weeks later he goes across the River Mersey, south of the River Mersey, he goes to Birkenhead, and he gives us another lecture, this time on the great Arabian teetotaler. Okay, and this is at the Birkenhead Working Men's Temperance Association. Now, Fatima was young; she was only 22, and she was secretary of this association. So obviously, somebody young who had, shown initiative. And she'd come from working class background. She was fortunate in that she was in the first generation to go to primary school. So in 1870, there was an act passed that children between the ages of 6 and 12 should get a primary school education. She was just got in, and she was in that first generation to get an education. Clearly, she was bright, curious, also socially conscious, was part of a big social movement like this, giving her spare time for it. So obviously somebody who's dynamic. So she meets Quilliam at this lecture. She's interested in what he has to say, but she has some doubts. She has some questions. She's heard various negative things about Islam, and Quilliam puts her mind at rest and says, "Look, if I can't make you believe, but here's my copy of the Quran. It was a translation of the Quran. Why don't you take it home and read it for yourself?" So that's what she did. She took it home, and her mum, who was the Scottish lady, Agnes, devout Christian, she saw her daughter reading something. She said, "Oh, what are you reading, darling?" And she said, "Oh, I'm reading the Muhammadan Bible." She said, "How dare you bring such trash into my home? Give it to me at once." And she said, "I can't give it to you. How can I know what it says if I don't read it for myself and understand? I'm not going to give it to you." So she ran into her room and locked the door. Her family kept trying to confiscate her Quran. So what she decided to do was to always carry it on her person. She never let it go. She honors the Quran this way. by protecting the copy that she has. In the interim, Quilliam starts writing letters to her to explain the fundamentals of Islam. She's still going to the weekly meetings of this small group of just three of them at this point, just three of them, her, Quilliam, and Gemali Hamilton. And she doesn't miss a meeting, but her family keep trying to stop her and lock her in, and she gets through a window and she climbs out and she goes to the meetings anyway. And she's dauntless, she doesn't miss a meeting. And so, as I said, the three of them in 1887, they set up this small group. They have a Sunday circle. They decide they're going to try and call local people to Islam. And it's really difficult for them because eventually word gets out and there's some local roughs who actually storm the meetings. She gets accosted on the street going to and from the meetings. And she was, on a number of occasions, pinned down and horse dung was smeared in her face. But she never stopped, never missed a meeting, never stopped going, showed real courage and bravery. And I think she was the only woman for quite a long period. It was only towards the end of the second year that another woman joins the community. So she was sort of on her own in that sense. So after about 18 months, the community of 3 has grown to 14. So it's a small group of 14 at this stage. And the landlord of the property says, look, I can't have anything other than the word of our Lord Jesus Christ preached in this temperance hall. I don't want any of your Mohammedan filth. So he ejects them out of the rented premises. But a crisis becomes an opportunity. Quilliam managed to secure larger premises on Brown Terrace, which is on a major road into the city, the West Derby Lane. And they move in on the 20th of December, 1889. And the first thing they do, and Fatima is central to this, the first thing they do is that they have a dinner on Christmas Day for the 230 poor children of the district, okay? They give them sweets, they have songs, they feed them, and there's no preaching. Quilliam said, people will think we're trying to take advantage. There's no preaching. But what he does do, he calls the press, the local Liverpool press, and says, look, while the Christians of Liverpool are stuffing their faces on Christmas Day, we Muslims are remembering the poor Christian children of this city and feeding them. So he was always aware of a good press opportunity and wanted to get one over on the Christians, always. And Fatima is really the other most significant figure in this small community. She, as I said, it got international attention. So she, with Quilliam, would represent the, if the dignitaries came, as I said, the word of this community spread. It became attached to the Ottoman court and the Afghan court, and many scholars of Islam would come and visit and so on. So she became the other representative of the community along with Quilliam. And she brought other women to Islam. She was very active da'i, or preacher of Islam. So about a quarter of the converts were women, and 63 women converted to Islam over this 20-year period. And average age was a bit older, 39. So Fatima was younger than most of the women who converted, being in her 20s when she joined the movement. And those women tended to be independent-minded. They saw Islam as a vehicle for the reform of women's rights. Fatima Elizabeth and Nafisa Keep both expressed those kinds of views. Some of these women married foreign Muslims, students and so on, and moved abroad, or traders, and they moved abroad. So in the book, which is here, in the book, I profiled, some of the other women converts to give a kind of broader picture, like Halima Murray, Helen Carser, Amy McCartish. They actually went off to live abroad with their husbands and didn't stay in England. But some of the others married fellow converts like Zuleika Banks and Amina Bowman. People often ask me, well, what happened to the children of the community? So we don't know for the most part, but I can tell you one story. Amina Bowman, who married a fellow convert, uh, there's a rare interview with their son, Hamidullah Bowman, from 1940. And it's very revealing because he says, "Oh yes, we used to go to the mosque, and I used to get up on a little at home. I was so impressed by Sheikh Abdullah Quliam that at home I used to get up on a little box, and I used to put a cloak on, and I used to give lectures at home. I used to practice when I was a little boy, and but he didn't. His mother didn't stay with the community. Later on, after he was baptized as an Anglican, and in that interview, he says, "I have full respect for my Protestant ancestors and for the Muslims." So he kind of was sort of in a in-between space, I would say, and that's not so surprising. So Fatima had a relationship with a strong relationship with the Indian Muslims. As I said, the Indian Muslims were the ones who helped to put this small community of converts. They kind of helped to professionalize the way that they ran. They helped them develop a constitution, and they did a sort of they did a big campaign in India to promote the institute and to raise money for it, and so. For instance, they did things like they published a constitution in India. They published the names of the first 40 converts in India. That record no longer exists in Britain, but it exists in India. And it's very important because it tells us a lot about the kinds of people who were converting to Islam. And Fatima was the person they trusted as the figure to promote the institute in India. I don't mean that she went out to India, but she was the one who was writing many of the articles and things like that. And also, two of her sisters convert to Islam, and both of them marry Indian Muslim law students. The other person who Fatima Cates had an attachment to was Shah Jahan. She was the Begum of Bhopal, and Shah Jahan is another very important figure for the history of Islam in this country. She contributes 2/3 of the money for England's first purpose-built mosque at Woking. And Fatima composes a poem to her, which is at the back of this book, where she compares Shah Jahan with Khadija. And I think that's very deliberate, Khadija was the one who believed when no one else would believe. She was the first to believe. She's a founder figure. And she took care and supported the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if you think about Shah Jahan as somebody who supports the first mosque, one of the first mosques in Britain, she cares. When there's very few Muslims, she supports them, and she looks after them, and she sees that their needs are taken care of when no one else is doing that. So I think it's very, very important. Compared to the Ottomans and the Afghans, Shah Jahan is the most generous figure in this period when it comes to patronage of the first Muslims who were settling in this country. So I think Fatima saw her as a role model, Fatima Cates, and Fatima Cates arguably is another. So Shah Jahan is one mother of Islam in this country. Another mother of Islam in this country is Fatima Cates. So the two women at the center of establishing the two first mosques in this country. Now, it wasn't only that Fatima was facing a challenge on the streets, going to and from to these meetings of the Muslim community, but also, unfortunately, she had suffered a lot of challenges at home as well. So she married Hubert Henry Cates in 1889. He had come from he was a marine engineer, was often away at sea. She marries him in 1889. They had already been engaged when she converted. Unfortunately, the honeymoon period is short, and after 4 months, the marriage descends into abuse and violence. They're separated, and when he comes back and says, "Look, I'll be on my best behavior," at that point he converts to Islam. Okay, this is in the summer of 1890, and she says, okay, we can get back together, but we're not going to live alone. I'm going to bring my sister, Clara, and we'll take in lodgers. Because the previous time when they were living on their own, he'd attacked her violently. She said, I don't want to live on, I don't feel safe. So, and at this point, Clara, her younger sister, converts to Islam in February of 1890. Sorry, 1891. And unfortunately, Hubert backslides. He doesn't keep his word. Again, it descends into violence on 2 occasions. And on the second occasion, right at the end, December 1891, he tries to kill her. And she only escapes with the aid of her younger sister, Clara. So after that, they never lived together again. But she sues for divorce, but is only granted a judicial separation. Of limited time. I mean, you can imagine what danger she's being put in here. But they never lived together again. So as you can imagine, she has given her all to the Liverpool Muslim Institute, but she's had a very rough ride. And alhamdulillah, after all this difficulty, she gets to have a break. She travels to the east for several months with 2 other English Muslimas, Zuleika Banks and Amina Makaish. And it's not known exactly where they traveled, but from our researchers, Egypt and Syria seem most likely. The reason why I say that is because her friend Amina Makaish had just given birth to a baby girl. Her husband was from Beirut. So it's likely that they traveled and they ended up in Beirut. I'd like to imagine that she got time, because she was there for several months, she got time to go to Damascus, and here we're imagining that she's in the great Mosque of Damascus, visiting and seeing the sites. She also travelled in the south of England for some time as well. So at the age of 35, the Crescent was a community newspaper in Liverpool, announces Fatima's death after illness, having lived with her son on her own. And this was at a distance from Liverpool, in a town called West Kirby. And her husband had died, the violent husband had died in 1896. So these are kind of what I call the sort of lonely widow narrative. So her final years were on her own, running as a landlady, getting income off renting rooms and living with her son, but living far away from Liverpool. So this is the way that it's portrayed in the obituary of the Crescent magazine. However, we don't think that that's the correct story, and I'll say why. So Fatima's son was claimed to be the son of the murderous husband, but in fact, when you look at the real dates on the certificates and so on, Fatima's son was born 17 months after Herbert died. So there's no way that he could have been the father. So obviously the father was somebody else. But the circumstantial evidence points strongly that Sheikh Abdullah Quilliam was the father. I'm showing you what evidence here. Look at the photograph. And the man on the right is Sheikh Abdullah in his 30s. On the left is Hubert Halim Quilliam Cates, as is known on his birth certificate. And I think the resemblance is striking. Now, Sheikh Abdullah advocated for openly and practiced polygamy. He had 2 other families, with Hannah and Mary, and had children by both of them. And Fatima, we believe, was his 3rd wife. You can speculate, but I could imagine that Fatima might have not wanted to live in the middle of these 2 other families or near them, because they didn't really get on. So maybe she wanted some distance. Who knows? When Fatima, when she passed away, it's sad to say she was largely forgotten. The Liverpool Muslim Mosque closed in 1908 as well. That's one of the reasons. But this community is rediscovered by local Muslims in Liverpool in the 1970s, and interest picked up strongly since then, especially in the last 20 years. So Fatima's grave was unmarked for over 100 years, but a headstone was placed there in 2022 after a fundraiser during Ramadan, and then money was raised in less than 24 hours for the grave. We had a national commemoration of her life in January of 2023 with 14 convert associations from around the country. It was very emotional and very moving. And now, alhamdulillah, I'm glad to say that people make regular ziyarah to Fatima in Liverpool, Anfield Cemetery, right near Anfield Football Ground. She's the only Muslim buried there, as far as we know, right in the middle of a sea of, right in the middle of a Christian cemetery. But I got a WhatsApp last year from a Somali lady in London who, with her son, took the train all the way from London up to Liverpool to read Quran for her, and then went back. She'd never been to Liverpool before, but she read this book and she went and read some Quran. You know, alhamdulillah, the sisters in Liverpool, they do khatams of Quran for Fatima. You know, remember that she's the one who upheld the Quran and protected the Quran, the Mus'haf of the Quran. You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala elevated her. So, you know, my thanks to my colleagues is not work that I've done on my own. I've worked with many colleagues on this community over the last several years, including translations from a Turkish account of the first mosque, was very interesting, and also a collected book of Abdullah Quliam's poems, which I co-edited with Ron Jeeves. And finally, Malana Hamid, with whom I co-wrote the book on Fatima. These are the books, but you can order the Fatima book. I don't know if I've forwarded the details for a discount code. I'm sorry, the publisher apologized. All the books are sold out at the moment, but he's reordering them. And if you order from the publisher's website, he will give you a discount if you put Cates into the appropriate box. Cates, Cates. So it's Beacon Books, if you Google them, and you should be able to get a copy if you're interested. So if you have any questions, then I'm here. Yeah.
How did she get the name Fatima?
I guess that was probably a name given to her, or I'm not, to be honest, it's a good question, because I'm not quite sure what the naming practices were in this community, whether or not Sheikh Abdullah, you know, offered a name to them, or whether they chose a name. There's no indication in the sources how that was done. But one thing I would say is that they seem to pick names that match with the first letter of their English names, if you see what I mean. So it would be like Hubert Halim, or, you know, you see what I mean? It would be Neville Nasrallah. It would always, they'd always feel like, I don't know what, maybe if they used their initials, then it could stand for both names. I mean, I don't know. But that was the naming practice, was basically, that's how it worked.
Is it really easy to find?
Yes, it's relatively easy to find people who can direct you to it. Yeah. But you should ask somebody. I wouldn't just walk in, because it's a big cemetery.
I'm not sure. Thank you for the talk. I'm not sure if I missed it, but how did she actually convert? So I got to the bit where she was carrying the Quran, protecting it, and she was going to the temperance meetings.
Yeah, so she basically was convinced by what she read of the Quran, and then this is very striking to me. The way they put it is they admitted themselves to Islam, because there was no one for them to say Shahada to. I'm not even clear they were clear that they had to say a Shahada. What they did was that it was modeled on the temperance movement. So in the temperance movements, they had a membership book. Okay, so the Liverpool Muslim Institute kept a membership book, and to join the society, you had to take a pledge. Okay, so the pledge was, I believe in God, I believe in the Prophet Muhammad, and I believe that everything in the Quran is true. So that was the kind of form of words that they said, and then they signed it. So they took the pledge and they signed their names. They put their previous religion, they put their profession and their name. So that book is now lost. It no longer exists. But as I said, the Indian Muslims, because they wanted to know, if you're raising money in India for Islam, anywhere, you need to know, like, is this real? Is it genuine? Has it got a proper constitution? Is this a charity we can trust to put our donations into? Right? You know what these Indian Muslims are like. So they had to make sure everything was proper. So basically, because of that, we've got the first 40 names from that pledge book. The book no longer exists, but the 40 names were recorded in an article published in India. So we've got the first 40 names, but we don't have the 243 names that were there. But yeah, it's a good question. So when they so they admit themselves to Islam, and then Rafiuddin Ahmed, who's a lawyer from Indian lawyer who came up in 1890 to kind of, sort them out in his own mind, he made them all say the Shahada in front of him again after they'd admitted themselves to Islam. But I don't know what the fiqh of that is. If there's no one to take a Shahada, can you admit yourself to Islam as a group?
In your heart, so between you and Allah. The Iman's correct.
But they've made a public statement as well, haven't they?
Public statement of Shahada.
No, they've not. Well, they've made some kind of public affirmation that they're Muslims, haven't they? And
the public statement is for rulings in the outward form as Muslims. But would they be considered Muslims between them and Allah? Yeah.
No, but even in fiqh, if they hadn't taken a formal shahada, but they'd said this form of words I mentioned, would that stand in fiqh?
Between them and Allah, as in with Allah, they're Muslims.
Yeah.
But publicly, if someone asked them and they didn't publicly say I'm a Muslim, then they publicly would be considered Muslim. As in, people would consider, it would be fine to say we don't know what Muslim are, because they publicly haven't shown their faith. But if they pledged something, then between them and Allah, they're Muslim.
Yeah, but they were preaching Islam, though, weren't they? So it was public, wasn't it?
So if it's public, then they would be considered Muslim.
Yeah, even though there's no formal shahada has been said.
You could say it's the written takes the maqam of the speech.
Okay. Okay. Alhamdulillah. So, any other questions?
Just if she had children or if she had a son,
Yeah.
do you know what happened to her progeny?
Yeah. So her son was very young when she died. He was only 4, and Hubert Halim, and he Quilliam, as I believe was the father, adopted him, and sent him off to a good boarding school. And when he moved to London, his 4th and final wife, looked after him. So, his London home was in Bloomsbury in central London, and it was open it was used as a Friday prayer space during the First World War. So at least he would have grown up with some Islamic kind of influence in his life. But I don't know if he died as a Muslim. Yeah, I mean, he was cremated. That's not a sign. That's not an Islamic practice. But I don't know more than that. We've tried very hard to track down his live, because he had children, but we've not been able to track down Fatima Cates' descendants to get some kind of family picture or history or whatever. Quilliam treated him equally. He got an equal share of his will, bequest, along with his other surviving children. So he treated him equally to his other children, as far as I know. So, yeah, that's all I know. I don't know. Unfortunately, I've not been able to find out more. Yeah.
Do you know anything else about the early community and their descendants? So, there's 40 or 60 people that took their shahada at the same time as Sheikh William. Does Sheikh William have descendants?
Yeah, he does. Yeah, he does have numerous descendants. Yeah, but he had 10 children. So, yeah. So his son Ahmed was the one who was he kind of was setting up to be his successor. So his son Robert Ahmed visits with his father to the Ottoman court in 1891. He's as a young boy, bounced on the knee of Sultan Abdul Hamid II in front of the whole court, and Abdul Hamid takes a shine to him and says, well, he should come and study at one of our elite schools, and he does for a year or so, and picks up some Turkish and French. French was the diplomatic language for the Ottomans. Many of the letters in the Ottoman archives are in French from the Ottoman diplomats. So when he came back in 1901, he became an Ottoman official. He was the deputy trade consul for the Ottomans in Liverpool. And Liverpool was a major port, right? A seventh of all the world's shipping went through Liverpool at the time. It was incredibly prosperous and busy. So obviously, as a trade, the Ottomans were interested in commercial diplomacy. So he was involved in that. And there's some letters from him in the Ottoman archives as a consular official. But it's a little bit difficult to know when the community collapses. I mean, he does receive people. They know who he is, Robert, but he's not active. And there isn't really a functioning mosque in Liverpool really until early 1970s. There was an informal mosque before that, set up by the Lascars, the Yemeni Lascars, but he wasn't really that involved in it. And I don't know much about his later life. So it's unclear to me. You have to remember that I think that his first wife remained a committed Christian her whole life. I think besides his two sons, I'm not sure about the other girls, how devout they were or not. So it's I can't really give a clear answer. Really, it would take a lot of research to find out track all the individual families. You're talking about 243 individuals, so that's a lot of families right there. And I've only been able to track a few so far, so I don't know. But I think we can assume that many moved away. As I said, many of the women married and moved abroad with their children, and others didn't stay within the faith or were not brought up in the faith. And I think it's important to say as well that unlike the early Muslim movements in the African American community in the early 20th century, they were hybrid movements. So they were somewhere between Christianity and Islam. So this community, at the beginning, they had something called in the first 4 or 5 years, it wasn't called a mosque, it was called the Church of Islam. Okay. And they had a Sunday divine service. At the Sunday divine service, they would have something that looked like a Christian service, but they preached Islamic monotheism. They sung hymns, but they changed the words so they were compatible with Islamic monotheism. But the form was Christian. And what then happened was that over a period of time, as I said, they became very well known. The Indians came, they sent the imams over and so on. So there was a kind of orthodox movement within the community over this period of 20 years. So in 1906, they issue a Hanafi, what I would say basically is the first Hanafi fiqh book published for local usage in the UK. So it was Tahara and it was Tahara and Namaz, basically, and with transliteration. But Quilliam always took the view that well, you know, people shouldn't pray in a language they don't understand. So he always kind of retained, but his congregation became more orthodox. So it's a complicated picture, but basically the interaction with visiting Muslims meant that they had to kind of confront the kind of orthodox teachings that those Muslims would say, well, this is how you do it. And so it was a sort of an organic process over time. But they never left this kind of Sunday divine service. But they changed from seeing it as an act of collective worship, and they began to see it as dawah. And so they reframed it. They never gave up the practice, but they reframed it as dawah. At the end, right at the end, they would have namaz for the Muslims only. So right at the end. But the first part, so the picture, I don't know if I can show you now, but the picture I showed you of the internal of the mosque, you saw stage. So there's an organ on the side where they would play the hymns. That was at the back. But facing also Qibla was the other side. Mecca, as they called it, I really like the phrase they used in the Crescent and called it Mecca. To face, today we say we turn and face the Qibla. That's what we say. So turn when you pray namaz and face the Qibla. But they didn't say face the Qibla. They say pray Mecca words, which I really like. Anyway.
So I've got a question on behalf of sister. So she's asked, how did Fatima Cates' experiences as Muslim women in Victoria, England, intersect with the feminist movements of the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the clearest example is the divorce law. So at the time in England, you had to show cause to get divorced. So you had to prove neglect, adultery, and things like this. You couldn't sort of mutually consent to divorce by agreement, which is the case in Sharia. You know, if you don't have to show a cause to claim a divorce per se, you could just mutually, but the mutually agree option was not there at the time. So because of that, one of the things, and because you can understand Fatima's story, she'd gone through a divorce, she'd gone through a painful experience where she was not granted a divorce. It was obviously important for her to understand from Sharia that actually she could have been granted a divorce under Islamic law, which was difficult for her to get, couldn't be granted under English law at the time. So many of the women in the community understood that these rights were there, and that informed their understanding, and it was part of what made them proud to be Muslims. I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know whether we can say it was feminist, because I don't know if that language was around at the time, but what I can say it was they understood that it was a question of their God-given rights and that they should be fulfilled.
I just wondered, from the writings of like these early Muslims, what was their view of like their British identity, say as they reverted to Islam? Did they already have, say, a negative view of their Britishness, or was it like they're still proud of being British? Or is there anything that's come across in the research that you've done about that?
Yeah, so I mean, you have to understand that there were very, very few Muslims in Britain at the time who were permanently resident. You know, probably less than 5,000. You know, other than that, you had a larger numbers of Muslims coming and going, but organized community life didn't exist. They built whatever they built in Liverpool. They built it from scratch, with no help really, no practical help, day-to-day help. I mean. So what that meant was there was no Muslim bubble for them to live in. They were part and parcel of their community. There was no bubble for them to go into. Like today, if you convert to Islam today in Britain, you can enter a massive bubble of 4 million Muslims. See what I mean? You can be absorbed into that, and you can probably, not that you should cut ties with your family, you have to maintain your ties, but what I mean, you could just be swallowed up in that world because it's big enough. Do you know what I'm trying to say? Whereas back then there was nothing. So they were part and parcel of their community. Quilliam was a really busy lawyer. He was, you know, he was known as the poor man's lawyer, so he helped a lot of poor people every day. At a very busy practice. Several of the members were trade unionists. They were involved in trade union actions. They were just part and parcel of the city's life. And a lot of the work they did in the mosque was very focused. They provided local adult education services for free because adult people were not educated. People wanted to be educated. These were working people. They wanted to help other working people. They fed the poor. They did a lot of kind of outreach work, which today is sort of becoming part and parcel of our mosques in the country today. In today, many mosques now do this kind of work. But they did this from day one because they were from that same community. They understood that the pressures that people were under. So, they fed the poor. They provided education. They opened up an orphanage in 1896 called the Medina Home for Children. That was run by Christians and Muslims together, but all the children would be brought up as Muslims. That was the agreement. So these were usually abandoned children as well, not just orphans. So children born out of wedlock, they would be abandoned. And Sultan Abdul Hamid gave £10 towards the founding of this orphanage. So there were a lot of good social works in the community. So they were not separate at all from the community. They shared the concept, and this is despite all the hostility and that they had at the beginning. I know I said that their meetings were violently disrupted and so on. This continued for the first several years, but Quilliam and the other Fatima and others were very judicious. They found a way to win people over patiently over time. They were able to get good press from the local press, supportive stories. That helped to change the reputation. They got support from the city mayor, but that only came after sort of 10 years of struggle. But also very wise in the way that they dealt with the local authorities, and they basically built the good reputation so that they could, people understood what they were doing, they understood they were helping the local community, and they gave them respect, that they gave them space to do their thing. Do you know what I mean? And the violent attacks stopped. I mean, there's a kind of parallel now in a way that we see we're living at a time where it seems like there's the drumbeat of Islamophobia is very loud, and there are graffiti on mosques. Some mosques get attacked. We're in that same kind of, angry voice. And I think, this story does have some practical lessons for us about, consistent service, the importance of public outreach, doing the right thing, being part of your community, helping people, and building a local reputation that provides you with the sort of, understanding and kind of hopefully a protection against, thugs, people who would just be prejudiced and violent. So I think, there are parallels there. And he persevered. They persevered as a community. So, I think that's very important. I think.
Which translation of the Quran did Fatima Cates have, and which translation was most used by the community? Because I understand, I think Muhammad Pickthall produced one of the most famous versions, and they would have been alive at the same time. So I wonder if that was the version that they had, or if that was produced after she passed away, maybe.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Marmaduke Pickthall published his translation in 1930. Fatima died in 1900. So until Pickthall published his translation, there was no. There was the Lahore Ahmadiyya did publish a translation in 1917. But the first kind of widely accepted one was in 1930 by Marmaduke Pickthall. But before that, it was only Orientalists who had translated the Quran. So the version they used was by Reverend George Sale, and he had translated it in 1734. It was quite scholarly. I mean, he used Baydawi to kind of try and understand and to make the translation, and I'm not saying it was perfect by any means. Quilliam, when he published sections of it, or commentated on it, or whatever, published sections of it in the Crescent, he would sometimes change the wording because he felt there were mistakes, and so he understood it was not the perfect, but it was all that they had. It was only really the only one available. There was another one as well by another reference, but Quilliam preferred this one. So it was used by the whole community, and this was the one that Fatima read. I mean, it's widely available. You can, it's online as well. You can read it if you want, if you're interested.
Sorry, can you repeat the name?
George Sale. Yeah. I wish. There's one copy preserved of another member of the community, passed down. I mean, the family no longer Muslim, but they have this copy of the Mus'haf, and we're trying to persuade them to sell it or donate it to the Abdullah Quliam Society, because they've set up an archive now, finally, an archive in a library, dedicated library, so they can store those things safely. Yeah, inshallah.
I just wanted to add one thing. I was just reading through Al-Imran,
Mm.
and I passed across this ayah. It just makes me think of that community.
Mm.
It says, ليسوا سواء من أهل الكتاب أمة قائمة يتلون آيات الله آناء الليل وهم يسجدون يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ويأمرون بالمعروف وينهون عن المنكر ويسارعون في الخيرات
ما شاء الله.
وأولئك من الصالحين. Make me connect with the ayah that story of that community.
ما شاء الله. جزاكم الله خير. ما شاء الله.
You mentioned about the early Muslim community in Bradford. Were they linked to Abdullah Quliam?
Not as far as I know. Yeah. I mean, they weren't isolated. They did all interact with each other. So there were Muslim networks in London that were important, and in Woking. So the people who were active were connected with each other. You know, they did sort of. They weren't working in little bubbles. I mean, they did connect with each other, and they did come together occasionally. Yeah, but there weren't many who were active, and you know, they were mostly working out of hired halls and premises and things. And there was a lot of political activism as well around rights, you know, for Muslims in the, you know, and a little bit of anti-imperial politics. You know, most of it was trying to work within the British imperial system for rights, and some of it was more strongly sort of anti-imperial. But most of that activity was in London. And when Quliam could be quite confrontational at times. So, you know, when I said the Woking Mosque was more sort of middle class and genteel, the Liverpool Mosque was more radical. It was more political, you know. I mean, spiritual, but political, you know. That was just the way they positioned themselves. And they took a strongly pro-Ottoman line, and that was very difficult, particularly in the run-up to the First World War, because while the British and the Ottomans had been allies against the Russians in the 1850s in the Crimean War, that was a long time ago, and eventually they sort of drifted apart. They drifted apart because Britain became, and the Entente Cordiale was aligned more with the French and the Russians against the Germans, and the Ottomans took the decision to side with the Germans over time. And so in the First World War, those were the sides, if you see what I mean, that emerged. So being Ottoman friendly in the First World War was a very difficult thing. I mean, Ottoman citizens were locked up and put in prisons in the First World War. It's not something, I'm not talking about soldiers, I'm talking about citizens living in, some of them were put in a prison in the Isle of Man. You know, it's kind of untold stories. But yeah. Any other questions? I think we're done, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Well, thank you very much.
Brothers, sisters, jazakallah for your time. Today we've taken great lessons from a historian, teacher, as well as an author. So just bringing to life history of Islam in Britain. So today we're definitely richer from your knowledge and the time you've shared with us today. We pray that Allah increases you in your work and blesses you with your family, inshallah. Of course, it's not the end of what Said Institute is offering. There's so much more. Next week, Friday, inshallah, we'll be inviting and we'll be hosting Dr. Salah Abdul Hajj. So we welcome everybody who has not yet been connected on the announcements of Said Institute on the Instagram pages and the WhatsApp group to see what's upcoming and partake in those events that's coming that we can bring to our community. Jazakallah khair for your time and may you all stay blessed, inshallah.